And let's see. All right, there we go. Well, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I've got a headset on this time to make it easier for people to hear. And we also have closed captioning, which you may be able to see at the bottom of your screen. But good evening. My name is Eleanor O'Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving history through primarily through oral histories, but we do some other historic preservation work primarily associated with the old Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, Pennsylvania. I also just want to say thank you for indulging us this month with yours truly giving the talk this evening, which I think you will enjoy. It's something that I've been working on for a little while now. But we did have another speaker lined up, but unfortunately he was unable to speak this month. So we always have plan B, as I like to say. If you could please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras for the presentation, that always helps with preserving bandwidth so we don't have any connectivity issues. So thank you for that. And as always, this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. We started this program in 2012, initially as live programs, made the transition to webinar at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, and we're hoping, fingers crossed, to begin getting back to some live programming perhaps in 2023, although you will hear about a likely live event coming up in November shortly. As a nonprofit, we do rely on the generosity of our patrons and those who may be interested in providing donations to our organization to help with lectures like this, bringing these lectures to you, as well as defraying the cost of some of our historic preservation work. And in addition to that, we are in the planning stages of putting a display area together at the old Johnsville Centrifuge that will be dedicated to the history of the Naval Air Development Center, of which the centrifuge was based. Also wanted to put a plug in for our YouTube channel. We do archive these lectures there, and I do try to keep that site updated with other related content to our remit with the Cold War and the space race. So definitely would encourage you to check out that site regularly because we do try to keep it updated and fresh. We also maintain a Facebook site for those of you who may be on Facebook. It's another way of reaching out to our organization in an easy way. And I do try to post some articles of interest up there that come across my feed, as well as we also have, this is another avenue for announcing any of our programming. Speaking of programming, coming up in October next month, which is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have Alice George joining us again to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and its implications. This will be an interactive Q&A session. I'll be facilitating the Q&A with Alice, and also would like to get questions from our loyal audience. So if you do have questions prior to the event, please email them to us at mail@coldwarhistory.org. I will be sending out a follow-up email after this program this evening, just as a reminder about submitting questions. So I just wanted to put that out there. And in November, fingers crossed, we're hoping to make this a live program in Warminster at the Centrifuge. And if I'm able to figure it out, I may try to live stream as well. So we'll see. But actually, Colonel Greg Marston, who has supported our organization in the past with some really wonderful talks, is in the process of writing a second book. And he is going to be speaking on, I think, a very topical subject, Afghanistan, then, now, and the future. And it's from his perspective as a veteran who spent significant time in Afghanistan. And again, just a reminder about please muting microphones and turning off cameras for the presentation. It's much appreciated. So without further ado, we are going to get into our presentation this evening. The title of this is called Hidden Figures of the Cold War in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I've been assembling this for some time, and it is, I think, a iterative work in progress. So you know, each time I've given this presentation, I usually have a new individual to talk about. So, but hopefully you will enjoy those that we're going to profile this evening. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with the term Hidden Figures, there was a movie that was released in 2016 called Hidden Figures, and it told the story of three African-American women who worked as mathematicians at NASA. And the theme of the story was that it shed light on the significant contributions of three women in particular, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. But also, you know, talked about the broader impact that women had behind the scenes at NASA, and going back to Project Mercury. It's a great movie, by the way, if you have a chance, if you haven't had a chance to see it. But, you know, Bucks County has its own hidden figures that actually contributed to winning the Cold War as well. And I'd like to tell you about some of these women this evening. Uh, the first set of women that we're going to talk about were scientists and or engineers who worked at the Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, Pennsylvania. So they were civilian employees of the Naval Air Development Center. I like to open up, you know, the talk just showing this one image that I find rather telling. As you can see, this is, I think, an awards ceremony at the Naval Air Center. And you can see that certainly it's predominated with men, not surprising for the time, but you have three women that are being recognized as part of that group, but three out of a multitude of individuals in the room. So the first person that I would like to talk about is Alice Stoll. And she is no longer with us, but I did have the honor of being able to meet her and interview her a couple of times as part of our oral history work in our organization. And I only became aware of this sort of preamble to her history before coming to Johnsville. She excuse me. And this goes back to 1936. So this is before she actually went into college. And she apparently had an interest in becoming an FBI agent. And she wrote to the FBI in Washington, D.C. and received a very polite response back. And you can see a copy of the letter there on the left-hand part of the slide. And you know, I would call your attention to basically the second paragraph of this letter. For your information, the only positions for female applicants in this bureau are stenographer and typist. Stenographer applicants are required to take a dictation test at the rate of 120 words per minute, and typist applicants must take a typing test at the rate of 45 words per minute. Signed, J. Edgar Hoover. So basically, J. Edgar Hoover was basically telling Alice, you know, your aspirations of being a field agent are basically slim to none. But if you'd like to, you know, spend time in the secretarial pool, we might be able to find a place for you. Well, fortunately, Alice decided to move on from that, and fortunately for us, she did so. So she went on to actually enter college in New York City, and she earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Chemistry and Physics from Hunter College in 1938. And then she worked as a research assistant at Cornell, and eventually enlisted in the Navy from 43 to 46. After the war, she returned to Cornell and continued her studies and received a master's degree in physiology and biophysics in 1948. She is actually one of the first female biophysics physicist graduates of Cornell University, actually. And she stayed on at Cornell for several years as a teaching assistant and a researcher in physiology and instrumentation. So you can see Alice there. Again, Alice and the guys in her graduation photo and work as a research assistant. So she was recruited to the Naval Air Development Center in the early 1950s, and her area of interest was in heat transfer between objects. And we'll get to more of that in a moment, because that's really what she is most well recognized for in terms of her scientific contributions. But when she came to the Naval Air Development Center, they were still in the process of actually putting a lot of the infrastructure together in Warminster at the time. And it turned out that her laboratory that she was going to use for her thermal research was not ready. So basically she had nothing to do. But she knew that the centrifuge was up and running. It had actually just started operations in 1952. And she went over to the lab and made some inquiries and said, look, my thermal lab isn't ready. I have nothing to do. Do you guys have anything for me to do? Is there any data I can analyze? So the head of the lab at the time said, hey, that's fine. If you'd like to familiarize yourself with some of the research that we've already conducted, by all means, here's a pile of data, have at it. So she decided to diligently go through this, attempt to understand the acceleration research that she had her hands on. And lo and behold, she ended up doing her own separate analysis of this data that wound up in a publication called Human Tolerance to Positive G as Determined by the Physiological Endpoints. Turns out that Alice basically had a different interpretation and insight to this data and helped to define essentially the limits or the spectrum of tolerance to the human body's exposure to acceleration. This insight into how much acceleration people can tolerate before they essentially go unconscious was really revolutionary. And this paper is still quoted in the acceleration literature today. So it's quite remarkable that, if it wasn't for the fact that this woman's lab wasn't ready and she was bored, we may not have had this publication in place. But eventually her lab was ready, and she had a small staff that she worked with. And this is an image that we've uncovered of the laboratory. And you can see on the left, Lambert Monroe, who was a technician that worked in her laboratory, one of the few African Americans working at the naval base, by the way. And there you see Alice on the right. And then in the middle, Maria Chianta, who was a chemist, who also worked alongside Alice. And we'll talk about Maria and some of her unique contributions in a moment as well. Another individual who was part of Alice's lab was a mathematician by the name of John Weaver, but we do not have a photograph of him. Something that I found amusing is in researching some information on Alice is one evening I actually came across a company that had a profile of Alice, and I certainly recognized her image right away. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And this particular company does work with thermal and heat transfer. So they certainly saw basically direct line of sight to Alice's pioneering work in Warminster. Now, the primary focus of her research was again on heat transfer between objects, and her initial work in her lab was really to understand essentially the tolerance of human skin to various heat exposures. This is actually an image of Alice's hand. She would actually perform some of these initial heat transfer experiments on herself. And you can see actually on her ring finger a blister that has formed as a consequence of some of this work that she was doing. In addition to that, there was some field work that was done at Camp Pendleton. You can see these are fetal pigs that were actually part of a thermal experiment at Camp Pendleton. So one of the few photographs that we have of their work. That actually is Alice, you see up here, writing down notes. And then in the center of the photograph is actually Maria Chianta, who was with her. Now, this initial work actually led to a patent that Alice and her colleagues are giving credit for. And this was a method and apparatus for thermal analysis. We actually were willed this device that we actually have in our collection. I have not displayed it yet, but someday I hope to actually put it on display. But essentially, this was a device that was used to quantify the amount of heat transfer to another object. In the case of a lot of their work was on skin. And what this eventually led to, all of this preliminary work in terms of quantifying this amount of heat transfer, was ultimately to actually look at something of what they called operational significance to the Navy, to Navy operations. And that had to do with developing an alternative to the material used in pilots' flight suits. The challenge that was put forward was that the original pilot flight suits were made of fabrics that oftentimes, in order to be flame retardant, were sprayed with material that over time would wash out or would be incompletely effective in terms of protecting a pilot from flame exposure if in the event of an aircraft accident. And unfortunately, in some cases, if the heat was intense enough in one of these accidents, the fabric even could melt onto the skin of the pilot. So this was obviously not an optimal situation. Ideally, that there was a desire to actually develop a material that had thermal resistance to it. Not that it couldn't catch fire, but there was a delayed time in which it would get to the point of catching on fire. So in other words, it would prolong the amount of time that would be given to a pilot to hopefully egress from the cockpit and to get out safely. So part of the work that was done, at least for over a decade at Johnsville, was a systematic testing of multiple different types of filaments that were woven into materials that were tested. And the image that you see here is actually the testing facility that was used for these fabric tests. And I have a lot of interesting photographs to show you this in operation. This was basically what they called a fuel fire test facility at the Naval Air Development Center. And it was basically enclosed on three sides with a steel fence. And then in the middle, we have where the experiments were done. So this is a better photograph. So actually, behind this brick wall is where Alice and her her technicians would be during these experiments. You can actually see holes here in the brick where they could actually view what was going on in the flame pit. But this pit was a concrete rectangle, and it was a basin that was filled with a shallow amount of water. And in each of these little squares, there's actually an outlet where jet fuel could be basically emitted and basically then floated on the top of the shallow water in the flame pit. And here you have a nice overhead view, so you can see where these jet fuel can be delivered, from nozzles at the base of each of these squares. And that was basically jet fuel, that was basically pumped in. Again, imagine this basically as a quantifiable test chamber, trying to use actual jet fuel, the type of fuel they would use, obviously, in an aircraft, so that they could test conditions as close to realistic as possible. And what they would do when they were testing materials is they had these dummies that were basically placed on this crane, and they would be dressed in essentially a prototype of a pilot's uniform with the particular material. And then they would ignite this flame pit basically with these four air propane igniters. So and then they would basically, this entire basin would become engulfed in flame, and the dummy mannequin basically is right in the middle of the action, and then they would have that going for a period of time, and then they would assess the damage that occurred over time to the material. Here you can see technicians preparing one of these mannequins that would be, again, swung back over the pit. Actually, I think this is probably at the end of one of those experiments. Here you can see the technicians basically lighting up the flame pit, and then in order to swing over the mannequin for testing. And there were also cameras, obviously, to record this as well. And that's actually where those holes are that I showed you through the brick. Here you can see technicians actually, putting on, dressing these mannequins basically before and then after the flame exposure. Here's an image of the mannequin actually during a flame test. And here's just examples actually of images we acquired. Interestingly, a woman in Texas found our website a couple years ago, and she had lived in Delaware, and I guess her neighbor had worked for DuPont, which was one of the companies that collaborated with Alice's laboratory. And this gentleman had images of a mannequin, which I recognized immediately, that was at Warminster. So these were probably materials that had been tested, that were DuPont materials that were tested in the flame pit. Actually, I'm going to go back one. So the significance of all this work and what it culminated in is that eventually Alice was working with DuPont in identifying these different heat resistant, thermal resistant filaments that could be woven into fabrics, again, that could be tested for their flame retardancy. And it turned out that they identified a filament called HT1, high temperature 1, that was something that seemed to have the type of characteristics that they were looking for. And lo and behold, after a lot of testing, they determined that HT1 would in fact be that fabric of choice for these pilot uniforms. Eventually, that filament, that fabric, was renamed and called Nomex. And you may recognize that name. It's a quite ubiquitous name today. It is has a broad amount of application, not only for pilots' uniforms, but race car drivers, astronaut EVA outfits use them. It's even used for covering pipes and so forth. So it has a broad amount of application that ultimately I think DuPont was able to be the benefactor of. In addition, one other little nuance, which I'll get to in a moment, regarding whether Alice was indeed the first to study Nomex, and our belief is that she was the first to pioneer work with Nomex. There were others before her that were doing work in the heat transfer arena, but she is really known, and her laboratory is recognized as the one that pioneered the testing, the systematic testing and identification of eventually Nomex as a heat resistant material. There were other experiments that Alice's lab was involved in. This, for example, was a nuclear detonation heat simulator. So there was some work that was done with that. There was a fair amount of work in general that was done at the Naval Air Development Center back in the 50s and 60s, early at the height of the Cold War, trying to characterize a number of things related to radiation exposure, because of course the threat of nuclear detonation was sort of always, front of mind for so many people in those early days. So here's just one example of work that Alice's lab, got pulled into in relation to that theme. This is another example of work where she was doing work actually with a cockpit and a more sophisticated simulation to examine heat transfer actually in a cockpit simulation. So all of this again culminated, eventually with the recognition of Alice's, contribution to the development of Nomex. And this is an excerpt of written comments that Alice actually made in 1980 back at Hunter College when she and Maria Chianta actually donated an endowed chair to the college. And I'll just read this because I think it really just obviously from the words of Alice summarizes what that legacy of that research really is. By 1980, we completed all the basic research required to create an internally consistent, experimentally verified body of knowledge with respect to pain and burn in human skin produced via all avenues of heat transfer, including conduction, convection, radiation, and flame contact. Again, that was the early work that was done with that heat transfer apparatus that she received a patent for. And then building on that, from this knowledge, we developed methods for measuring the thickness of the skin and skin temperature for thermal sensation and damage, given the intensity of heat applied. That's, the picture of her, doing experiments on herself and inducing blisters, a 2nd-degree burn. Skin temperature for thermal sensation and damage given the intensity of heat applied, and predicting the thermal properties required for materials to be used for skin damage prevention, or conversely, the thickness of insulation materials required for materials of known thermal properties, i.e. that's the work with Nomex that you saw with the fire pit. Now, a little PS to the story of Alice. Couple years ago, we were actually contacted by the National Inventors Hall of Fame, which is actually a outlet of the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, a group I had no idea about the National Inventors Hall of Fame, but they had actually reached out to us because there were some women apparently who had made an inquiry about whether Alice Stoll had been inducted into the Hall of Fame. She has not. And the women were quite surprised by that because Alice, throughout the course of her career, had received many accolades and recognitions for her work in the development of Nomex. And they sort of thought it was a foregone conclusion that she would be recognized here in the Inventors Hall of Fame. Subsequent to that inquiry, we actually did submit a nomination for Alice to be recognized for her work with Nomex, and that nomination is under review, potentially for induction in 2023. So fingers crossed that Alice will at long last be able to be recognized for this quite significant scientific achievement. So the next person I'd like to talk about is one of the few African-American researchers and women scientists at the Naval Air Development Center. Her name is Gloria Chisholm, and Gloria is actually still with us. So Gloria actually attended Howard University, received an undergraduate degree in psychology, and then earned a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1960. She worked for the duration of her career at the Naval Air Development Center as an experimental psychologist, and initially managed a life sciences research group, and then a vision research laboratory. And she's really known for her work in vision and vision protection, and particularly visual issues related to pilots in high performance aircraft. She, consulted widely in all branches of the Department of Defense, as well as NATO and other worldwide organizations, authored 2 books, and has had a number of other significant accolades throughout her career. Now, one of the most interesting things that she actually led when she was working in the Vision Laboratory at the Naval Air Development Center was work in a device to help protect pilots from so-called flash blindness. So, you can imagine that if a pilot is flying and witnesses a nuclear detonation, the brightness of that, the intensity of that light emanating from that nuclear explosion could be enough to cause blindness. Obviously not a good thing to happen with a pilot. And in addition, obviously, radiation exposure as well. But the most immediate concern would be the eyesight of that pilot. Now, the Vision Laboratory, under the direction of Gloria, was actually involved in research that led to the development of this prototype helmet to protect pilots from the so-called nuclear flash blindness. This was a prototype. It never actually became fully operational. It was more of a proof of concept. And what's really ingenious, I think, about this is that there were flash sensors in the helmet that, in the event of detecting this bright flash of light, it would actually trigger between the lenses on the goggles to be flooded with opaque black printer's ink, which was from the National Cash Register Company, by the way, that would protect the pilot's eyes. So this instantaneous flooding, to protect them. Now, unfortunately, that also means that these helmets would only be good for one-time use. So there would be limited utility, but nevertheless, they did demonstrate the feasibility of flash blindness protection in this manner. In addition to this work, Gloria Chisholm also holds several patents to her name as well, related to eyewear protection for military pilots. So this initial, proof of concept work certainly did not go, unknown within the military. Eventually, there were other innovations as follow-on to that. And this is an image of what was developed ultimately by the Air Force as their solution for the potential of flash blindness. And this is another ingenious solution, but not unlike, what Gloria's lab had developed with regards to this, flooding the visual field with a light opaque material. In this case, in these glasses known as PLZT goggles, the lenses are made out of a sandwich composite of polarized glass and an inner layer of transparent electro-optic ceramic. And apparently, when in the event of a flash event, this will actually trigger a break to the electrical circuit that's circulating in these goggles, and then that will change the polarity of the lenses, and they'll go black. But I believe that these are actually reversible. So, it's not like the one and done like you had with the ink flooding the visual field. So this is a little bit different. Not inexpensive, though. I mean, it was developed for over $7 million, but still, this was ultimately what was developed for that purpose. But again, a lot of this initial pioneering work was, certainly has a lineage back to Gloria's lab and her work with vision. And another individual that we want to talk about, we've kind of mentioned her already with her association with Alice Stoll, was Maria Chianta. And I have to say, we don't have a lot of information about Maria. What little information we have, we were able to acquire from friends of Alice Stoll. Maria and Alice were very close. They were close professional colleagues as well as close personal friends since their time in New York. And you can see here a picture of both of them when they were serving in World War II as part of the waves. Now, again, this is what we gather in terms of our knowledge of Maria. She received a chemistry degree from Hunter College and a diploma in physics and radiology from the New York School of Radiography. It's probably at Hunter College where Maria, gained the acquaintance of Alice. She worked in research at New York Hospital and Sloan Kettering Institute, and then joined the Navy at the same time that Alice did. And during her Navy years, she conducted research in bacteriological warfare defense at Camp Detrick in chemical and biological defense research. We'll talk about this more in a moment because this is quite interesting. And then she worked in Hawaii for a period of time, and then eventually came to the Naval Air Development Center around at the time that Alice Stoll did. And not only did she assist Alice with work on, the thermal work that she was involved in, but also what continued work in biological and chemical protection of aviation personnel, work that was actually and remains actually top secret, and which is probably why we're unable to get much information out of that. However, the work that she did at Camp Detrick, now known as Fort Detrick, outside of Frederick, Maryland, the work that was done in World War II was with botulinum toxin, or coming from the organism Clostridium botulinum. And that produces, of course, that can produce botulism, and it's a serious, sometimes deadly disease. And typically starts with paralysis of muscles in the face. And if it's untreated, paralysis moves down, and many of these individuals die of respiratory arrest because the muscles requiring breathing become paralyzed. And fortunately, this is a pretty rare occurrence nowadays, but there still are people that do succumb to botulism, in the United States on an annual basis, and a minority of them will actually go on to die. I do want to point out, technically no reports of botulism in the US have been linked to bioterrorism, but the work that was done at Camp Detrick was specifically because of this concern in being used against the troops in World War II. And what work that was done at Detrick, and we assume that because of Maria's chemistry degree, she probably was involved in this research that was looking at refining means of isolating and purifying botulinum toxin. And ultimately, this went on to develop basically a toxoid vaccine, an antidote that could be given to the Allied warfighters that were deployed during the D-Day invasion of, in the 1940s. There were reports that I believe turned out to be false, that there was a belief that the Nazis were trying to plan on use of deploying botulinum toxin as a bioweapon against the Allied troops, which is why there was so much interest in developing this toxoid vaccine. Now, you might think, okay, this is all kind of interesting, but, fast forward to today, I think just an interesting PS to this whole story is that the long-term knowledge gained from the ability to isolate this and purify this botulinum toxin is that eventually it became used in pharmaceutical research. And I think almost all of us have probably heard of Botox. Well, Botox is a direct descendant of this research and has been used for a broad array of medical conditions beyond trying to reduce the wrinkles that we usually hear about, but there are many other conditions that Botox actually can be used for, including, for example, migraine headache. It has a use. So it's kind of neat to think that here Maria is deployed during the war, doing this top secret research to hopefully prevent a mass exposure of our troops to botulism, and in turn, down the line, eventually that work did find itself to the pharmaceutical industry for the benefit of patients. This is just a picture that we came across of Maria, again, with all the guys here at an event that was something called the International Air Standards for Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Defense, and it was an air standardization coordinating committee. So, again, we are aware that this knowledge she had of bioweapons and the work that she continued to do at the Naval Air Development Center certainly made her a sought-out expert for committees such as this. So before we get to some of these other miscellaneous stories, just to sum up, I think you can appreciate that, in terms of those hidden figures that were working at the Naval Air Air Development Center made significant scientific contributions, outside of the military, but also within the military for protection, of pilots from thermal injury to potential flash blindness and potentially protection from bioweapons. So all very significant in their own right. But I'd like to tell you some other interesting stories that we've come across. This one, I think, which you'll be quite amused with, is about Amelia or Millie Klicka. She was a captain secretary at the Naval Air Development Center, passed away in 2018. And you can see pictures there of Millie. Now, there's another picture of Millie, and you can see the quote, at the bottom of the page. This is from the base newspaper, saying, the job of a secretary is basically to keep their boss happy. Well, speaking of that, she actually one day in the 1970s, I think this was like 1976, she gets on the phone to give one of the heads of overall scientific work going on at the base a call and says, Bill Von Beck is on his way here and he's bringing some Russians with him. Russians? This is like, the height of the Cold War. We're having Russians coming to a Navy base where secret work is being done, for the military. This is a problem. Well, Naval Air Development Center was the Navy's Center for Airborne Sensors for Detection and Identification of Aircraft and Submarines. This was a key center for anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War. In fact, one of the most significant programs that was based at NADC was the P3 Orion program. They basically, engineers there conceptualized, built, tested and operationalized the Orion aircraft, which had a critical role in helping to win the Cold War. So obviously some highly sensitive information we don't want having passed on to our enemy. So that was obviously, this was a potential, a threat in terms of that. So we got to be concerned about security here. So good, Millie. We're glad that you actually warned us here. Now, she mentioned a gentleman by the name of Von Beck. Well, that actually is Harold von Beck, who was an Austrian physician and pilot with the German Luftwaffe in World War II. And after the end of the war, he ended up in Argentina and worked for the Argentine Air Force. And his interest was in aeronautical research and also in reduced gravity. So this was a guy that was, interested in, in space flight and safety of pilots, and looking at acceleration. Well, eventually, he accepted a job here in the States to work for the Martin Company and went to work for Martin actually at Holloman Air Force Base, another area that was doing acceleration research at the time. In fact, John Paul Stapp actually was doing work on the Daisy track there with horizontal acceleration. Later, he eventually landed in Warminster, and he was a director for medical research, where he continued this work on aeronautics and and work on acceleration. So that's who Von Beck is. Well, turns out Von Beck had invited some cosmonauts who were at a meeting in Philadelphia. It was an aerospace medical meeting. And Von Beck, I guess in his enthusiasm, decided, oh, great, we got these mutual interests in spaceflight. Why don't you come up for a tour to the base? We can show you the work that we're doing on the Johnsville centrifuge. Okay, well, these are two of the gentlemen that were going to come up for a visit. This is Peter Klimek and Vitaly Sevastyanov. These were both Soviet cosmonauts that had recently flown a mission in the 1970s and were, I think, guests of honor at this medical conference. Well, they descend upon the base, and in preparation for them coming to the base, it was decided, they probably need to put a plaque together to commemorate this, auspicious visit, which you can see being presented here by the base commander, Grover Yowell, and the individuals that you can see gathered here in the captain's office, going from right to left. The tall gentleman in the blue suit is Bill Lyons. That was the gentleman that Millie called to warn that the Russians are coming to the base. You can see one of the cosmonauts then next to him, Captain Yowell, and then another representative from the Soviet Space Agency in the middle, Harold von Beck, flanking him to the left, another gentleman from the Russian Space Agency, and then finally a gentleman curiously not staring at the camera, but staring at Bill Lyons. That was a KGB agent. Now, as they decided to head out to do a tour of the Johnsville Centrifuge building, Millie apparently ran up to Bill Lyons and, according to Bill, this is from an interview that we did with him, and he said, well, Millie was looking at me an odd way, so I hung back and she whispered, "The plaque is misspelt." And according to Bill, he goes, I kept mentally picturing the Russians talking about this visit and showing the plaque back at the International Aerospace meeting in Philadelphia. And the misspelling would be discovered and there'd be a lot of laughter and jokes. And, this would be like a big international incident. It would end up in the newspaper. It'd be a huge embarrassment. So we can't have this happen. So what was done is they somehow convinced the group that they would hold the plaque back just so they didn't have to carry it while they were going on their tour of the centrifuge. Meanwhile, Millie is running off to where they had the plaque made at the base to have a correction made to the plaque. So we have the group here, of course, touring the centrifuge. You can see the centrifuge arm in the back of them. Oh boy, they had a chance to actually sit in the gondola to check that out. Isn't that exciting? And then at the end, of course, with no one the wiser in the group, Millie slipped them back the corrected plaque and certainly saved the day. So we have to give recognition to Millie, the faithful secretary, for having recognized this potential calamity and being able to circumvent an international incident. Another individual that we've recently learned about is Mickey DePasquo. Now, this individual, she was an engineer, an electrical and electronics engineer who worked at the Naval Air Development Center. Now, she actually, we had no idea, but she actually has quite a large amount of notoriety in the TACAMO community. TACAMO standing for Take Charge and Move Out. This is part of the, the fleet actually with the Air Force that in the event of a World War III, these aircraft are going to be flying and they are able to communicate with submarines, and the president is able to, send messages and direction to the fleet in the event of, nuclear war. So there was a lot of work that went on with the development of these aircraft and the communication systems, and much of that work was actually done in Warminster. In fact, this was next to the P3 Orion program. TACAMO was, I think, maybe the second largest program that occupied a lot of the engineers' work. You can see very significant contributions that Mickey herself did. And she was one of the only women that were working in this at the time. She led tech teams evaluating new types of communication and navigation systems. And this was during two different periods of aircraft that were deployed for the TACAMO mission, and also a follow-on program known as the E6 that was developed as part of these efforts. So many different, any sort of basically element of the TACAMO mission she was intimately involved in. And for that, she was actually the first civilian inductee into the TACAMO Hall of Fame. I never knew about this, but the TACAMO Hall of Fame, and that was in 2014. And she was recognized for her unparalleled knowledge of the TACAMO mission and how to test the equipment to operationalize it for fleet use. So quite a significant contributions to TACAMO. And one other person we want to mention is Emma Fessenden. And this is another individual we don't have a lot of information about, but we have some photographs, which are always fun to share. So we did recently have the opportunity to find out a little bit more about Emma through someone who worked with her, Dennis Kiefer, who worked in operations at the Johnsville Centrifuge. And this is what he recalls of Emma. I worked with her for several years. She had a chemistry degree. She was part of the team working for Bill Damon, another significant engineer working at the Johnsville Centrifuge, who developed and ran centrifuge projects. She was more of a researcher than a technologist. She developed projects, did all the hard work of making them happen, analyzing data and writing reports. And she also worked very closely with another individual by the name of Dick Crosby, who was a mathematician who worked at the centrifuge and was involved with research with him as well. And also she knew analog computer programming and taught me a lot about it. And, you know, I find it interesting that he specifically mentioned her programming expertise because it harkens right back to those original Hidden Figures that we talked about from the 2016 movies, the so-called computers that worked at Langley for NASA. So here's a little bit more about Emma that we've actually recently been able to unearth. She did indeed have a chemistry degree and then a master's in physical chemistry. And in World War II, she served with the Women's Army Air Corps as a technical engineer draftsman and was awarded several medals for her work during World War II. She also was involved in dental research, interestingly, at the Guggenheim Institute, and also assisted in the physics laboratory. And this work that she was doing eventually led to her position at the Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, where she served as a research scientist in analog computer programming for lab and field acceleration at the Naval Air Development Center, the centrifuge. So she worked alongside these other individuals that were involved in acceleration research. One fun fact we did unearth is that apparently she went to clown college and graduated from there. So I can imagine this, that she probably had a pretty fun sense of humor. The image that you can see here on the right, which I happen to be always bemused about, is this was actually a promotional photograph that we understand Emma she was not directly involved in the operations of the centrifuge that you can see depicted here, but apparently this was like a promo photograph that they needed, and they basically just grabbed the first woman that they saw, put her down in the seat, and lo and behold, here we have the picture today. What I find also amusing about this picture is that you see her in these red pumps. So it's like she's looking like a boss while she's operating the centrifuge, but we all know it was basically a staged photograph. We do have several photographs of Emma with all the guys that were involved in research when the Mercury astronauts were training at the centrifuge in the late 50s and early 60s. So here you can see Emma in the lower left-hand corner, along with the other researchers and technicians that were involved in Project Mercury. Again, you see her there. Here's a picture with them all surrounding Gus Grissom. And another photograph here with Emma and her colleagues at the centrifuge. So, we're always, Emma's story is significant because we don't have a ton of information about Emma. And we're always looking for new information. So we certainly, if anyone ever, comes across information about any of these individuals, please feel free to share them with us. We always love to be able to supplement this presentation. Two other quick things I want to touch on. These are very new pieces of information that we've recently uncovered. And this one kind of really surprised me, was about Betty Skelton. And Johnsville as a real hidden figure. Had no idea about this. Now, Betty Skelton, as many of you may know, was an acrobatic pilot and also held a land speed record. She was known as the First Lady of Firsts, and she was pivotal in creating many opportunities for women in aviation, auto racing, astronautics, and and advertising. So quite an accomplished woman in her own right. Now, interestingly, we just recently found out that Betty Skelton actually was at Johnsville in October of 1959. And she was invited to undergo basically the same type of testing that the Mercury astronauts were undergoing at the time. And of course, one of the training things that the astronauts were involved in was acceleration training at Johnsville. So she actually rode in the Johnsville centrifuge just like the Mercury astronauts. And in fact, the Mercury astronauts really took a shine to Betty Skelton, and they were impressed with her ability to roll up her sleeves and do these tests and do just as well as the guys did. And in fact, because of that, they dubbed her Mercury 7.5. That credit goes to Wally Schirra, one of the Mercury astronauts. So 7.5 of the Mercury 7. And here's a picture actually of Betty getting ready to get into the Johnsville centrifuge. That's the original gondola that was used during Project Mercury training. So she was doing the same testing that the astronauts were doing at the same time. And here's a picture of her inside the gondola, readying for her so-called flight in the centrifuge. And this is actually a quote from an oral history that was done at Johnson Space Center of Betty Skelton and in 1999. And I thought this was a pretty funny observation about her time at Johnsville, and I can read this to you. They briefed me on this and that and the other. And as the two technicians were putting me into the centrifuge, which they spin around for G loadings, I was quite accustomed to negative G loadings as well as outside or negative G loadings from her flying. As they were putting me in the capsule, one of them said, and this was an advertising campaign that was going on back in those days, one of them said, "Golly, wouldn't that make a great ad? I dreamed I rode the centrifuge in my maiden form bra." And they were a great group to work with. I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the centrifuge ride, and it's not every day you get to do something like that. So I think she really was an intrepid soul. And incidentally, for any of you that are interested in the seeing a photo display of these tests that she underwent, the Mercury tests, they actually were part of Look magazine, an article that was published in February 1960, Look magazine. And you can still get them, pretty easily off of eBay. I actually purchased a copy. So we had that as part of our archival collection. But, this was a surprise about, lo and behold, a hidden figure. We had no idea it visited Johnsville. And for those of you in the audience who might actually not be from Bucks County, but from Montgomery County, the adjoining county, there is a hidden figure story for you too. And the Apollo guidance computer. So during Project Apollo, when we were planning on landing on the moon in the 1960s, that the guidance computer in the command module was the first production computer to commit to use of integrated circuits. And integrated circuits were also part of the computer on the lunar module that was used for descending down to the lunar surface. Integrated circuits were actually developed by the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory. And it was actually Fairchild that developed these initial circuits. And at the time, the Apollo program actually basically commandeered the market for needing all these chips at the time. So there was this huge need for, mass production of these chips for the space effort. Well, guess what? Here we have a picture of women on the assembly line at Philco Ford, which was based up in Montgomery County, and they were involved in the production of these integrated circuits. Even though Fairchild developed these, that the production of a lot of these chips was licensed out to Raytheon and to Philco Ford. So you can see a picture of the women on that assembly line developing these integrated chips. So many hidden figures that you can see here working on our space program from Montgomery County. So to summarize, you know, Margot Lee Shatterly, who actually wrote the book Hidden Figures, upon which the movie was based, she, I thought this was a pretty insightful quote about showcasing women whose work's always been present but unknown. Reviewing them and pulling them out of the shadows creates more complex and nuanced view of history. And it's one thing to read something, but it's another to see it actually come to life. So I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation this evening. Again, it is a iterative work in progress to uncover some of this history, but it has been fun to be able to delve into that. And it's nice to also recognize that we do have our own hidden figures history in Bucks County and Montgomery County. And obviously many more stories to tell and uncover. And I want to thank the scientists and others for their contributions to winning the Cold War, the space race, and beyond. So with that, I am going to open things up for questions. So thank you for your attention.
Eleanor, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So you mentioned several times that these several of these ladies were awarded patents for their inventions or their developments, and so my understanding is that those patents actually belong to the Navy or to the government. But do you, in your collection there, do you actually have the original patents, or those, or copies, or if there are original copies of the patents, are those someplace in the Navy collection?
Yeah, you know, like that one image I pulled down of Alice's patent, that came directly from the paperwork that you can get off the U.S. Patent and Trade Office.
Okay.
I believe I do have some patent. They will send you like a certificate that's like signed, and there's like a ribbon with it. And I do think I've come across a couple of these with other individuals that we have in our collection. So so yeah, they are given a certificate when they're actually awarded the patent.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions?
I saw something in the chat.
Oh, let's see. We do have a couple things in chat, so let's take a peek there. So, oh, thank you. So Mark Smith actually mentioned he worked with Gloria Chisholm on display system to drive a 1-inch round display. Interesting. Thank you for that. All right, and let's see. Steve Cloak has a comment. A guy named Gary Latham graduated in 1953 from Neshannomy High School in Langhorne. That's in Bucks County. He led development of the device Neil Armstrong deployed on the moon to measure vibration. Wow, now that's interesting. That's a new one. I didn't know that. You know, what I do know is that there was work on a, I know that Armstrong carried a device on Gemini 8 that was not able to be deployed. It was a camera. I think it was a low-level light camera. And because of the, you know, issues they had with Gemini 8, with the thruster getting stuck and going into a high-speed spin, any of those experiments got aborted. And I believe they ended up reflying that on Gemini 11. So there is, I was aware of that in association to NADC, but I did not know about this. So thank you for that. I'm going to have to definitely look into that a little more closely. Great. Thank you for those comments. Does anyone have any other comments or questions? Criticisms? Happy to always take criticisms with the presentation.
Hi, Eleanor.
Hi.
Thanks for a great presentation. I got to duck off now. It was good catching up with you again.
All right.
Hopefully we'll see you next month.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good day.
Will do. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other comments? Did anyone else, if anyone is former NEDC, did any of you have any interactions with any of these individuals that we profiled this evening? Other than Mark, who worked with Gloria.
Hey, Eleanor, I worked with Mickey for a few months.
Oh, okay.
It was an experience. I'll
She,
just
I can,
leave it at that.
from
like work-
having interviewed her, I can
It was like-
understand that.
It was like working within a tornado.
Yeah. Any other comments? All right. Well, I think we can call it an evening. Again, just a reminder, October 13th is our next webinar with Alice George, and we'll be talking about the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the way, she has written a couple of books on the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you do happen to look her up, I know those are available on Amazon. I was just looking at those today, and I'll be facilitating a Q&A. I will, again, as a reminder, I'm going to be sending out a notice. If anyone has questions about the Cuban Missile Crisis that you'd like to have answered, please feel free to send those to us, and I will add those to the queue for next month. But we'll have opportunity for open Q&A as well during the event. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for indulging me with this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next month. So thank you. Good night.
Good night.
All righty.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.